Mother's Day, May 10, 2020. The road out of Salida, Colorado, carries the usual mix of early May mountain air, cool, clean, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and pine. Suzanne Morphew pedals her bike past the edge of the neighborhood, the same route she's ridden hundreds of times before. Her family is away, the house is quiet, the only thing abnormal is the date, a day meant for celebration, not for vanishing. By evening, her absence has hardened into something concrete. The bike is found along a stretch of road near a field, far from her usual loops, the frame intact, the helmet nearby but not attached. There are no signs of a classic crash. No gouges in the asphalt, no twisted metal, no frantic tire marks. The scene suggests interruption, not accident, yet the terrain around it offers no clear explanation. No one reports a violent encounter, no one hears a scream. The place where the bike stands should feel like a question, not a conclusion. Suzanne was 49, a mother of 2 daughters, the kind of parent whose life was structured around the small, predictable rhythms of family and routine. She exercised, she stayed in touch with friends, she kept her home running. From the outside, there was nothing to suggest this Sunday would be the last day anyone saw her alive. Her husband, Barry Morphew, initially explains that he was away for work when she disappeared. He returns home, cooperates with deputies, sits for interviews. The early narrative fits a familiar template: worried spouse, frantic search, a community of volunteers and law enforcement scouring the rugged landscape. The first wave of searching turns up almost nothing. Divers scan streams, dive teams run lines, local volunteers comb the high desert grass and juniper. The bicycle's location does not sit comfortably with a standard accident report. The helmet is found at a slight remove, as if it had been placed there rather than cast off in a fall. Barry's story begins to show small inconsistencies, one detail here, a discrepancy in timing there, that investigators start to note but do not yet treat as proof of anything. The feeling for those watching the case unfold is not certainty. It is a growing sense that the explanation offered does not quite match the scene left behind. Over the next year, the investigation tightens its focus on the home, the marriage, and the digital trail. Barry's phone records, his GPS data, his social media activity, and his relationship with Suzanne are all examined in detail. The narrative splits. On one side, a husband who claims he did not know what happened to his wife, who cooperated with authorities, who lost his spouse in a baffling disappearance. On the other side, a series of facts that, when placed together, suggest someone who may have had stronger incentive than he was letting on. The case is not yet a trial. It is a long, public, speculative build-up of pieces that do not yet form a settled picture. By May 2021, the legal posture shifts. Barry Morphew is arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder and several related charges. The affidavit that supports the arrest lays out a version of the story in which the crime is not a last-minute impulse, but a calculated act born out of a relationship that had begun to fracture. The authorities allege that he killed Suzanne in advance of leaving town for work, then orchestrated the bike scenario to create the impression of a random disappearance. The language of the affidavit is not neutral. It frames the event as a domestic homicide scenario rather than a mysterious vanishing in the wilderness. The arrest throws the case into a conventional legal rhythm. A defense team is assembled. Motions are filed. The prosecution's case is subject to scrutiny, and the defense scrutinizes everything in return. At the center of the legal conflict is the question of evidence disclosure. The judge assigned to the case begins to signal that the prosecution has not fully followed the rules about handing over certain materials to the defense. This is not a minor technical detail. In criminal law, how evidence is handled can decide whether a case survives. By April 2022, the first chapter of the prosecution's case against Barry Morphew ends without a verdict. The judge bars key witnesses from testifying because of the repeated discovery violations. The charges are dismissed, but in a way that leaves the door open. The dismissal is issued, without prejudice, meaning the state can, if it chooses, reopen the case later. The immediate effect is that Barry Morphew walks out of court as someone who has not been convicted, but whose conduct still casts a long shadow over the narrative of Suzanne's life and death. The dismissal does not resolve the mystery. It merely shifts it into a different phase. The family is divided. Some members of Suzanne's side continue to believe she was a victim of a crime and that the failure to convict Barry does not mean he is innocent. Others, including Barry's adult daughters, publicly stand by him, insisting he had nothing to do with her disappearance. The public narrative now has two competing emotional arcs playing out side by side, one of unresolved grief for a woman who vanished, and one of perceived injustice toward a man who feels he has been unfairly targeted. Meanwhile, the question of Suzanne's body remains unanswered. Months pass, then years, with no clear trace of her. The absence of a physical body leaves the case in a kind of legal limbo, and the weight of that uncertainty settles over Salida like a slow, quiet pressure. The photographs on the lawn signs fade in the sun, the flyers grow brittle, the local coffee shop stops putting her name on the community bulletin board. The state of the case feels less like an active investigation and more like a place that has been temporarily frozen, waiting for something to shift. Then, in September 2023, the forensic picture shifts. State investigators working on a separate case stumble on human remains in a remote field near Moffat, Colorado, roughly 40 miles south of Salida. The bones are scattered, partially buried, and the location is not the sort of place where a casual hiker would normally leave traces. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the relevant coroner's office work to confirm identity. Eventually, the remains are positively identified as Suzanne Morphew's. The discovery does not come with a clean forensic signature. The condition of the remains does not allow for a simple, neat explanation of how Suzanne died. What the autopsy can show, however, is enough to confirm that this was not a case of a woman who walked away and simply chose to disappear. The physical evidence now aligns with the earlier narrative of foul play, even if the exact mechanism of death is not fully resolved. The legal system begins to re-engage. The case is reassigned to the 12th Judicial District, where a new district attorney's office reviews the investigative file and the new forensic data. The absence of a body had been a major obstacle for the earlier prosecution. With a body now located, that obstacle is at least partially removed. The question is not just whether the prosecution can prove that Suzanne died, but whether it can prove that Barry Morphew caused her death and did so with the mental state required for a first-degree murder charge. In June 2025, a grand jury sitting in the 12th Judicial District returns an indictment against Barry Morphew for first-degree murder, along with additional charges tied to the handling of the crime scene and the aftermath. The grand jury does not determine guilt. It only decides that there is enough evidence, at this stage, to justify taking the case to trial. The indictment is a formal acknowledgement that the state believes the case has now reached a point where a jury can decide the facts. The practical mechanics play out quickly. Barry Morphew is arrested in Arizona during a traffic stop and transported back to Colorado to face the new charges. The earlier dismissal in 2022 does not keep the case from being revived. The law allows for that when new evidence and a new legal framework come into play. Bond is set at a high level, reflecting the seriousness of the allegations, but the judge later modifies the conditions so he can remain under GPS monitoring while the case proceeds. The defense argues that the earlier case failed because of prosecutorial missteps. The prosecution argues that the new evidence and the discovery of Suzanne's body strengthen the state's position enough to justify a trial. The narrative now enters its most public and uncertain phase. Barry Morphew pleads not guilty to the murder charge. His lawyers continue to argue that the first prosecution was mishandled, that the evidence is equivocal, and that the new case is built on the same shaky foundation. The prosecution, for its part, argues that the discovery of Suzanne's body, the ongoing forensic work, and the accumulated digital and circumstantial evidence combine to form a coherent case. The judge sets a trial date for later in 2026, signaling that this will be a sustained legal proceeding rather than a swift resolution. At the heart of the public discussion is the tension between what is alleged and what is proven. The prosecution's narrative is that Barry Morphew killed his wife, staged the bike scene to mimic an accident or random disappearance, and then used his position as a concerned husband to deflect suspicion. The defense's narrative is that the first case collapsed under the weight of prosecutorial misconduct, and that the new case is built on the same incomplete and speculative evidence. The question for the broader audience is not just whether Barry Morphew is guilty, but whether the legal process can still function effectively after the earlier dismissal and the prolonged absence of Suzanne's body. The timeline of the case has become a series of turning points rather than a single, clean arc. The arrest in 2021, the dismissal in 2022, the discovery of the remains in 2023, the re-indictment in 2025, and the upcoming trial in 2026 all form a sequence that reflects the complexity of real-world investigations. Each step does not neatly resolve the questions that came before it. Instead, each step adds new layers of interpretation, new debates about the weight of evidence, and new opportunities for both sides to argue their positions. The story is not finished. The final chapter has not yet been written. Years have passed since Suzanne Morphew last rode her bike down that road, and the people who knew her are still living in the aftermath of that day. The trial, when it happens, will not erase the uncertainty of the years in between. It will simply add another layer to the story, another set of questions that will be answered inside a courtroom while others remain outside, in the quiet spaces where families remember and speculate and try to make sense of what happened on a Mother's Day that never ended.